Hello students, welcome to MOOC Political Economy. The topic for our discussion today is classical liberalism. Any ideology is a set of ideas, but it is also at the same time a program of action. When we want to understand the liberal ideology, we realize that it has a justificatory claim in favor of liberal practices. But these practices were found to be relevant and important for the rising commercial class around 17th century England, where it all began. The early liberal movement began in 17th century England when the principles of individual liberty reigned supreme. The liberal ideology was born within the womb of feudalism. Feudalism, as you know, was a closed society, and there were all kinds of social control which frustrated activities of individuals. And this kind of frustrating scenario was not suitable to the interests of the rising commercial classes who wanted to reap super abnormal profits. In fact, the rising commercial class at this historical juncture had become extremely powerful because it was intoxicated with the lust for wealth. It had amassed a huge amount of wealth thanks to the Industrial Revolution, which opened up opportunities for mass production, and also because of the discovery of trade routes, which allowed the capitalists to take their goods to faraway countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. But although opportunities for abnormal profits stared them in the faces, the rising commercial classes were uncomfortable with the kind of restraints that were imposed by the Roman Catholic Church, by the feudal society, and by the norms prevalent in those times. The historical context of liberalism is important to appreciate. In fact, the liberal theory becomes comprehensible only against the backdrop of the historical context that gave birth to it. The old feudal forces gave place to new and vibrant economic forces of commerce and industry who clamored for liberty in every sphere of life. The outcry for liberty of freedom is understandable in view of the heavy hand of feudal exploitation, which stifled the freedom of the people all through the Middle Ages when feudalism reigned supreme. So, liberalism basically emerged as a justification for capitalism, which in fact is the main issue. And since the emergence of liberalism was inextricably linked up with the interests of the rising commercial classes, the ideologies and beliefs of the rising commercial classes had a decisive impact on the basic contours of the liberal ideology. But the thing is, although liberalism treated everybody as equal and therefore equally entitled to freedom, please understand that liberalism does not unfold over a level playing field. There is already inequality. If you ask a lame man and an able-bodied man to run the race from the same point in the name of equality, the result can only be greater inequality. And this is exactly what happened once the liberal ideology became operative. So liberalism became associated with inequality. Accordingly, it has always tended to make an antithesis between liberty and equality. With the close of the 17th century, the foundation of a liberal philosophy fully emerged, but its close association with the propertied classes hardened its heart against the poor. For early liberalism actually did not seek to liberate all men, but only the propertied classes from the authoritarian restraints imposed by the state, the church, and by the traditions. But I told you just a moment ago that any ideology has a justificatory claim. In case of liberalism, it tried to justify that this was the best society for the individual. And that is why it constructed an image of man which would be in agreement with the ethos offered by a liberal society. The liberal concept of man projected the human being as a consumer, as an infinite consumer and desirer of utilities, as a bundle of appetites demanding the maximum possible satisfaction. Such a theory thus portrayed a good society as one which maximized human satisfaction and utility by instituting the widest possible freedom of individual choice. The liberal society facilitated the maximization of the aggregate satisfaction of the individuals, and it was claimed that this maximization was achieved in an equitable manner. The liberal tradition had been built in a market society whose ethos was competitive maximization of individual utilities. This market society also marked a shift from ascription to achievement. You know, feudal society, everyone was born to his lot. So a serf remained a serf forever, irrespective of the enterprise that he may be able to exhibit. But in capitalism, the focus shifts from ascription to achievement. And this ethical basis of liberalism was justified by Puritanism. The new ethos was Puritanism, a potent force in preparing the way for the commercial civilization. It glorified the profit-seeking activities of man, and this was in sharp contrast to the traditional Christian ethic, which tried to inculcate in every individual a sense of social responsibility. It was argued that we are all children of God, and God will be happy with us and will reward us with heavenly salvation only if we look after our fellow brothers and sisters. And that is why you will recall that at this juncture, the saga of the noble Samaritan was eulogized, and it was expected that every individual would display a heightened sense of social responsibility. This sense of social responsibility was gradually replaced by the concept of individual responsibility, which was brought in by the Puritan Revolution, which tried to argue that since God was keeping a direct watch over every individual, there was absolutely no reason to blow the role of the church or any such intermediate institution out of proportion. Every man was individually responsible for himself. The task of the liberal state, therefore, was simply to protect and enforce the mechanism of free contract and to ensure each the right to such property as he could acquire by his own labor and his own efforts and contracts. The state, under the circumstance, was assigned a limited role. In fact, you will often come across the very clear depiction that the liberal state was a night watchman state, some kind of a police state, which would step in only in the event of a breakdown of law and order. Otherwise, it would simply stand aloof and watch. In fact, the basic ethos was summed up by the phrase that the state exists because crime exists. Therefore, the work of the state is not to foster and promote, but simply to prevent and check. What were the problems with this kind of a liberal philosophy and the liberal state that it projected? First, critics pointed out the claim that the market system maximizes aggregate satisfaction of the aggregate population. This is highly subjective, and thus it cannot be compared on a single yardstick. Secondly, the liberal theory did not imply distribution of goods and services to all from the standpoint of individual need, but the perfect competition which the liberal thinkers assumed was a myth. It was assumed that everybody was in an equal state and equally poised to take advantage of the opportunities offered by liberal society in the name of freedom. But I have just clarified to you that freedom actually was not equally available to all. Not everybody was on the same footing. So definitely it was not something which everybody could utilize to the same extent. When unequals were treated equally in the name of freedom, the result was inevitably greater inequality. Therefore, in this way, liberal theory aided the widening of the already existing disparities between man and man. Although liberal theory was initially welcomed by all, after all, please try and understand how the heavy hand of feudalism had suppressed the urges of the people for freedom and free enterprise all these ages. So when liberalism came to the center stage of Europe, everybody welcomed it and responded to it almost like parched land does to rain. But after some time, when liberalism had become operative and people had already satisfied and consoled themselves with the thought that they were repositories of freedom and they were enjoying this wonderful entity called freedom, which previously had been denied to them, they were expecting some tangible changes to percolate in their lives. Unfortunately, that did not happen. And this is what puzzled them, because they kept comparing their plight with the plight of the affluent sections of the society, and they saw that while the affluent sections were in pomp and splendor and plenty, they were getting increasingly impoverished. But there was one other mark of disparity between the affluent sections and the commoners, and that is the affluent sections had the right to vote. These people, of course, did not have the right to vote, but as ill luck would have it, they misplaced the equation and they thought that the affluent sections were affluent because they had the right to vote. It was quite the other way. In fact, they had been given the right to vote only because of affluence, because you will remember that franchise was initially not adult and universal. Only Parliament was created as a repository of propertied interests, because the king was expected to play the role of only the policy implementer. The king had done the blasphemy of introducing taxation in order to go ahead with his various charitable exercises, and this had aggrieved and disappointed the commercial classes who did not want the king to interfere with their property rights in any way whatsoever. So the wings of the king had to be clipped, and that is in fact why the king was dissociated from his legislative power and Parliament was erected as the bastion of legislation. Unfortunately, however, the common people thought that if they had voting rights, they would also become affluent like the richer sections in society, and that is why they started clamoring for extension of franchise. This is basically why liberal theory ultimately had to be democratized. And that is why I would like to clarify to you that what you understand today as liberal democratic theory, actually, they are not inseparable twins. They did not happen at one and the same time. Liberal democratic theory of today was initially only liberal theory. It became democratic much later. The incorporation of the democratic element happened when the common people started clamoring for extension of voting rights, and the rich sections by then realized that this concession had to be admitted. Otherwise, there was always a fear of a socialist revolution which would undo all that capitalism had amassed through the ages. Accordingly, liberal theory now was required, in consonance with its democratic element, it was required to project a new conception of man. The earlier conception of man was, of course, retained. Man was still portrayed as a consumer of utilities, but alongside it was held that he was also an exerter of energies. And that is what justified the incorporation of the democratic element. And that is why Macpherson clarifies that man is not a bundle of appetites seeking satisfaction, but also a bundle of conscious energies seeking to be exerted. Such exertion of human energies is facilitated only in a liberal democratic society, which gives man not only economic freedom, but also social and political freedom, so that he can give vent to all the qualities that lie latent in him. However, the problems with liberal democratic theory cannot be overlooked. They are largely the same as those that we have seen in case of liberal theory. I have been telling you that liberal theory makes the mistake of hardening its heart against the poor. And the incorporation of the democratic element, which is engineered by liberal democratic theory, is basically a facade. Okay, the icing on the cake is changed. That will definitely not alter the essential ingredients or the taste of the cake. This is exactly what you find when you assess liberal democratic theory. That is precisely why liberal democratic theory, despite its tall claims, remains at heart liberal theory. And it will continue to be guilty of all the ills which we have seen in case of liberal theory. Despite its democratic facade, liberal theory is unable to address the real needs of the weak, the lame, the poor, and the blind. Although economically liberal democratic theory styles itself as the welfare state, undertaking to take care of the basic needs of the population, particularly those who cannot contribute to the gross domestic product of the society, the resources that the state is able to pump into such welfare activities is invariably less than what is drawn out of the majority of the population. The liberal democratic theory, which was liberal first and democratic much later, therefore continues to be committed to the justification of an ethos of free enterprise that is embodied by capitalism. This kind of a liberal democratic theory with which you are familiar is basically the ideology of the industrialized West. So deeply have liberal ideas permeated political, economic, and cultural life of the people that their influence becomes almost impossible to discern, liberalism appearing to be indistinguishable from Western civilization in general. The two seems to have completely coalesced. Liberal thinkers in the 18th and 19th century, influenced by an Enlightenment belief in universal reason, tended to subscribe to an explicitly foundationist form of liberalism, usually linked to personal autonomy. This form of liberalism was boldly universalist in that it implied that human history would be marked by the gradual but inevitable triumph of liberal principles and institutions, and progress basically was understood in strictly liberal terms. So let us now look at some of the cardinal themes of liberalism. Liberalism, as you know, gives priority to the right over the good. In other words, liberalism tries to establish conditions in which people and groups can pursue the good life as each defines it, but it does not prescribe or try to promote any particular notion of what is good. That would be amounting to some kind of an imposition on the individual if the state tries to clarify to the individual what is good, because every individual is left to define goodness for himself. However, this does not mean that liberalism is simply a philosophy of do your own thing. While liberalism undoubtedly favors openness, debates, and self-determination, it is also characterized by a powerful moral thrust. The moral and ideological stance of liberalism is embodied in a commitment to a distinctive set of values which constitute the backbone of liberalism, and it is to a brief assessment of these elements that we will now turn. The first is attention on the individual. In the feudal era, you will please understand, the entire focus was on groups or group identity. The individual always considered as part of a larger community, be it the family, the village, the local community, the church, or the social class. Their lives and identities were largely determined by the character of these groups in a process that changed little from one generation to another. As feudalism was displaced by market-oriented societies, individuals were confronted with a broader range of choices and social possibilities. Freedom of enterprise was celebrated. A serf, for example, whose family has always lived and worked under the heavy hand of feudal exploitation, inhabiting the same piece of land that has been passed on from one generation to the next, he suddenly becomes a free man and acquires ability to choose who to work for, what opportunity to utilize, whether he will leave the land, and whether he will look out for work in the growing towns or cities. This individualism had implications. First, it drew attention to the uniqueness of each human being. Individuals are primarily defined by inner qualities and attributes specific to themselves. Second, they nevertheless share the same status in that they are all first and foremost individuals and therefore are of equal worth and therefore entitled to equal opportunities. A belief in the primacy of the individual is the characteristic theme of liberal ideology, but it has influenced liberal thought in different ways. It has become clear that liberals view society simply as a collection of individuals, each seeking to satisfy his own needs, interests, and ambitions on the basis of the freedom that is available in a liberal society. Such a view has been called atomistic, inasmuch as it conceives the individual as isolated atoms within society. Indeed, it can lead to the belief that society itself does not exist, but is merely a collection of self-sufficient individuals. This, however, is also one of the points on which liberalism has been criticized, because it often gives rise to extreme individualism, where the individual feels almost bereft of all social bonds and connectivity. Such extreme individualism is based upon the assumption that the individual is egotistical, essentially self-seeking, and largely self-sufficient. This sometimes can strike at the very foundation of our concept of society, because society grows from the premise that no individual is self-sufficient, not only for his material wants but also for his emotional ones like companionship, friendship, love. He needs the company and cooperation of others. So atomization of the individuals can often pit the individual in an abyss of freedom, which is basically not something he wants. C.B. Macpherson therefore characterized early liberalism as possessive individualism because he argued it regarded the individual as the proprietor of his own person, or capacities owing nothing to society for them. In contrast, later liberals have held a more optimistic view of human nature and have been more prepared to believe that individuals possess a social responsibility for one another, especially for those who are unable to look after themselves. In fact, way back Aristotle had reminded us that he who seeks pleasure in solitude is either beast or God. Therefore, social nature of man can hardly be overemphasized or exaggerated. The next important theme that we come across in appreciating the liberal ideology is freedom. Our belief in the supreme importance of the individual naturally leads to a commitment to individual freedom. Individual liberty and freedom are often used interchangeably, is for the liberals the most important value in life, and in many ways the unifying principle within liberal ideology. For early liberalism, liberty was a natural right, an essential requirement, almost a precondition for civilized human existence. It also gave individuals the opportunity to pursue their own interests by exercising choice, the choice of where to live, who to work for, what to buy, how to live, and so on. Later liberals have seen liberty as the only condition in which people are able to develop their skills and talents and fulfill their potentials. But although freedom is important and every individual is definitely keen to use his freedom to make the most of his life, one must understand that there is always the fear that one can exercise one's freedom in socially undesirable ways. What if I exercise my freedom in a way which can harm the enjoyment of freedom by others? This has been sensitized by various scholars. John Stuart Mill realized that it was possible that freedom of one can be jeopardized by the irresponsible or reckless behavior of another. But then, if therefore freedom is denied to individuals as a whole, that might amount to throwing the baby away with the bathwater. And in order to save the situation, John Stuart Mill therefore distinguished between self-regarding and other-regarding actions. He opined that self-regarding actions are those actions of the individual over which the individual will have a free hand because it does not encroach upon the space of any other individual, and with regard to these, the state should not in any way interfere. But with respect to other regarding actions, if they are damaging to others, then of course the state should step in the larger common good. What is important to appreciate here, that Mill tries to bring in the role of the limited state in an important way, keeping room for any kind of intervention on part of the state for the sake of the collective order. Isaiah Berlin also tried to highlight the distinction between negative and positive freedom. Early or classical liberals have believed that freedom consists in each person being left alone, free from interference and able to act in whatever way they choose. This conception of liberty is negative in that it is based upon the absence of external restrictions or constraints upon the individual. Modern liberals, however, believe that negative liberty or the availability of the space is only one aspect of that freedom. Charles Taylor, for instance, draws attention to the insufficiency of the negative concept of freedom, because freedom is not just about ensuring space, it must also be about utilizing that space. That is why we are familiar with the euphemistic expressions that distinguish negative and positive freedom. They are the opportunity and the exercise concepts of freedom, respectively. One needs that space, negative freedom, to be able to do what one wants. And doing what one wants actually leads man or the individual on the path to self-realization or self-mastery, which is the ultimate goal of freedom. The next important attribute of freedom is reason. The liberal case for freedom is closely linked to faith in reason. Liberalism is and remains very much part of the Enlightenment project, and we know that as a result of Enlightenment, which bid farewell to the Dark Ages, human reasoning dawned in a major way and brought the light of civilization to human minds, who thereafter started exhibiting a temperament of criticism about every aspect of life and living, and not accepting anything and everything uncritically, as was the case all through the Middle Ages. Enlightenment rationalism influenced liberalism in a number of ways. In the first place, it strengthened its faith in both the individual and in liberty. And it tried to highlight that individuals are capable of defining and pursuing their own best interests. But the belief in reason builds into liberalism a strong bias against paternalism. Not only does paternalism prevent individuals from making their own moral choices and, if necessary, from learning from their own mistake, but it also creates the prospect that those invested with responsibility for others will abuse their position for their own ends. A further legacy of rationalism is that liberals are strongly inclined to believe in progress. Progress literally means a forward movement. Rationalism thus emancipates humankind from the grip of the past and from the weight of customs and traditions, and which also is often associated with uncritical acceptance of conditions of living that has been handed down across the generations. The next important element is justice. Human beings are seen to be born equal in the sense that each individual is of equal moral worth, an idea embodied in the notion of natural rights or human rights. Second, foundational equality implies a belief in formal equality, the idea that individuals should enjoy the same formal status in society and should be entitled to equal opportunities. Therefore, liberals fiercely disapprove any social privilege or advantage that are enjoyed by some by denying to others on grounds like gender, race, color, creed, religion, or social background. This, of course, leads to a belief in meritocracy, which we also see as part and parcel of liberalism. And finally, the last important element that I would like to highlight about liberalism is toleration and diversity. Pluralism or diversity can be said to be rooted in the principle of individualism. However, the liberal preference for diversity has more commonly been associated with toleration. And the essence of toleration is beautifully captured by Voltaire, who said, "I may not agree with one word of what you have to say, but I shall defend till death your right to say it." That is the soul of liberalism, which many people understand also as the sine qua non of a democracy. So on the one hand, toleration represents the goal of personal autonomy, and on the other hand, it establishes a set of rules about how human beings should behave towards one another. For the individual's point of view, toleration is primarily a guarantee of personal autonomy and thus a condition for moral self-development, which lies at the soul of liberalism. Thank you.